the press conference that rocked the nation. 4 senior judges of the Supreme Court questioning the administration of the highest court of the land.
About a couple of months back, exact date and all will give, 4 of us gave a signed letter to the Chief Justice of India.
Then the opposition scrutinizing recent high-profile acquittals. Sadhvi Pragya, Swami Asimanand, Colonel Purohit, Maya Kodnani, and the Justice Loya case. Then came the CJI impeachment row initiated by the Congress.
We will certainly move a petition in the Supreme Court to challenge this order, and we are confident that when we move that petition, the Chief Justice has nothing to do with it when we move it.
Vice President now needs to appoint an inquiry committee of 3 judges in consultation with the number 2 judge of the Supreme Court, because obviously he can't consult the Chief Justice on an impeachment motion against himself.
And now, in the latest row to hit the judiciary, government asking the Supreme Court Collegium to reconsider its recommendation of Justice K.M. Joseph.
January 10, 2018 Supreme Court ने लिखा, the Collegium considers that at present Justice K.M. Joseph, who hails from Kerala High Court and is currently functioning as Chief Justice of Uttarakhand High Court, is more deserving.
कांग्रेस पार्टी को न्यायपालिका की गरिमा के बारे में हमसे सवाल पूछने का कोई अधिकार नहीं है। कांग्रेस पार्टी ने भारत की न्यायपालिका की गरिमा को कमजोर करने में बहुत बड़ी भूमिका निभाई है।
They can't take the findings of others and act upon them. They can't delegate these powers to the to some politicians and other interested persons.
And while it was hoped that the issues that were raised in the press conference in January would be sorted out internally, 3 out of the 4 judges have recently written letters to the CJI about their continued concerns, suggesting that all is not well within the highest court. The Supreme Court has given us landmark after landmark judgment, and as Mirror now salutes the top court, we ask, is the Indian judicial system in crisis? Let's debate.
You're watching the Urban Debate on Mirror now. Faye D'Souza, good evening. Thank you for joining me. This is a question we have to ask at this point because so many things have happened since January this year until today. It almost seems like the question of whether or not our judiciary is in crisis just will not rest. Today, it is a question of the appointment of judges to the Supreme Court. We should have been celebrating. Indu Malhotra would be the first Indian woman to be appointed as a judge in the Supreme Court. But we have controversy again. Justice K. Joseph's nomination, which came alongside Indu Malhotra's nomination, has been sent back by the government of India, saying that first of all, he has far more people more senior than him for this position. Why him? And secondly, since he is from Kerala, Kerala would be overrepresented. The controversy got deeper when 100 lawyers signed a petition saying withhold both appointments until you can appoint them together. The Chief Justice turned around today and called that unthinkable, unimaginable and not possible to withhold the appointment of Indu Malhotra, who would be the first woman in the Supreme Court. But the question we're going to ask today, viewers, and this is a question we have to ask as Indians today, because remember, when things don't work out for us with our government, who do we turn to? We turn to our courts. We turn to our courts to look after our fundamental rights. We turn to our courts to protect our democracy. We turn to our courts to simply save us. Is it a cause for concern? Are our courts being compromised? And should we wipe it under the carpet if 4 senior judges are still concerned, if they're still writing letters? And if politics is constantly getting in the middle of what's happening in our Supreme Court? Joining me on the show today are legal legends who will help us understand where we truly stand. Through the course of the conversation, we'll also be joined by Soli Sorabji, former Attorney General of India, Siddharth Luthra, Senior Advocate with the Supreme Court. Right now, we have Mr. Arimasundaram, Senior Counsel with the Supreme Court, and Mr. Vivek Thankam, Member of Parliament in the Rajya Sabha with the Congress, and also a very senior counsel. I welcome you, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Thankam, I'm going to start with you. Is politics getting in the way of justice?
No.
What is your reaction, or what is your response today to Justice Joseph's appointment, or the fact that it has been sent back?
First of all, let me clarify that nobody is, at least from our side, nobody is interested in doing politics with judiciary. Because if there is no judiciary, there is no democracy. And if there is no democracy, there is no freedom. And if there is an institution today in which people had so much faith, it's this one institution. But in the last few months, we've seen a great slide. I mean, so many questions are being raised about people manning the highest offices and the positions. 4 senior judges came out and spoke in public and appealed to public. Now today we have a government which returns a file after keeping it for 4 months. First of all, I'm questioning, why did they keep it for 4 months? Which law authorizes them to withhold files sent by the collegium? Collegium, as per the judgment of the Supreme Court, decides the merit of the person we want to be elevated. 5 judges have applied their mind. Now you can send it back if there are reasons of national security. Now there were no reasons of national security involved in this case. And if that was so, you could have done it in 15 days. You keep withholding it for 4 months. In between, senior judges send letters to the Chief Justice, urging him to take steps to ensure that these appointments take place. Now, as a reaction, then you separate the 2 names. You send one name, which we welcome. Indu Malhotra is a welcome addition to the Supreme Court, because she's amongst the first lady member of the bar who gets this opportunity from our Supreme Court bar. So we welcome her. And then withhold the name of Justice Joseph and send it back for reconsideration. I mean, this reconsideration is not even permissible in law. So what is the present government trying to achieve by humiliating the judiciary? Aren't you humiliating the judiciary? When such independent judges with such unimpeachable conduct are treated like this, what do you think is the future of judiciary then?
Mr. Sundaram, I want to bring you in here on that point of Mr. Thankam saying that the judiciary is being, intimidated. Given the fact that we all know Justice Joseph was the one who set aside President's rule in Uttarakhand, which was seen as a blow to the current government, would that intimidate judges in their daily jobs, because they would have to worry about their next position if the government is going to intervene in this manner?
I'm too great a believer in the judiciary and its innate strength to believe that it can be intimidated. But if you're asking me, is there an attempt to intimidate it? It certainly appears that there is, not only by the ruling party, by the opposition also. I'm sorry to say what we saw, the events of last week, appeared to be politicizing an impeachment issue to make it so political, not political but politicized, that it was really hitting it by one party against another using the judiciary. Now what we have seen is very, very unfortunate for 2 reasons, and I'll tell you those reasons. You see, first of all, let's accept one thing. It is within the power of the government to send back a name which has been sent to it for reconsideration. It is open to the government to do so, and it is normally expected. It will be done in rare cases if there are very good new reasons to come up. Not poppycock reasons like seniority, he's junior right now, he's not the senior most judge, or that the regional has already got a judge of the Supreme Court, both of which is absolute nonsense. Justice Krishna Iyer was a very junior judge when he was elevated. I can go through names and names. Justice Kapadia was the junior most Chief Justice when he was elevated as the Chief Justice. This is not a reason at all. It's a court of merit. After all, under Article 141, what the judges of the Supreme Court say is the law of the land. You want people with merit. There was nothing in this return which says anything about merit, anything about integrity, anything about the things which could really say otherwise. And this nonsense about regional, we are not going to regional representations and things like that. And secondly, there are 2 states which already have 3 judges each in the Supreme Court. There's nothing wrong in that. So I am pointing this out not because of saying that it can't be sent back. Of course it can be sent back for good reasons. But we have to look at the overall scenario. Look at what has happened. The government has sat on the MOP for more than a year. Without the MOP filling in of vacancies, all this is getting into a big problem. There are numerous vacancies in the Supreme Court, in the High Courts, and there are increasing number of pendency of cases. And this MOP is not being settled at all. By the MOP not being settled, what is indirectly being done is the government is trying to stifle what the effect of the judgment in the NJAC case was. The NJAC case really was that, look here, there shall be an independent judiciary. There cannot be interference with the judiciary in the appointment of judges. Now, by sitting on the MOP, you immediately delay the matter. Then names go for, or recommendations go. Government sits on the recommendations. 4 months, we have 7 vacancies in the Supreme Court, and you wait 4 months to even return the names. At least one name, which was approved by them. Thank God for that, so that Indu Malhotra can be sworn in as soon as possible. But to return a name after 4 months, keeping it waiting for 4 months, what are you doing in effect? In effect, when you say, ask me that question, is it a case of intimidating the judiciary? I told you, no, I don't believe the judiciary can be intimidated. But is it an attempt to intimidate the judiciary? Is it an attempt to prevent the judiciary from acting? There, I'm very worried, because the basis of a democracy is the separation of powers. And as long as there's a judiciary which is keeping a check on the government powers, then the government also has to work within its constitutional framework. Now, it strikes me that a government which doesn't want to be checked, which wants no checks and balances on its own action, it would best benefit them that they have an ineffectual judiciary. And what worries me is that through this attempt to see that the judiciary to an extent is not going to interfere with the government, what they're really hitting at is the very separation of powers, independence of judiciary, and are hitting at democracy. I can tell you honestly, Faye, I was completely in support, completely against the NJAC judgment. I believed that the executive should have a role in the elevation to judges. But after seeing what has happened over the last few months, and seeing what is happening with the MOP, seeing how judges are not being elevated, seeing how a judge's name is returned for reasons which apparently are not clear, although I always believe that none of us is really blind, although justice may be, everybody feels, perceives that the reason is the Uttarakhand judgment. And in which case, today I'm saying thank God for the NJAC judgment, because otherwise I don't know what could have happened.
Right. I understand Mr. Soli Sarabji is with us right now as well. Mr. Sarabji, if you can hear me, former Attorney General of India, thank you so much for giving us your time. Just to bring you up to speed with the conversation we've had so far, we've had Mr. Arimasundaram tell us in no small terms that he believes the reason for returning Justice Joseph's nomination is not valid, that the government's reasons in this case are, and I'm quoting, he said, poppycock reasons, they're not good enough. And given last week's impeachment attempt and this week's return of the judge's nomination, it looks like political parties are interfering with the judiciary. Do you agree, Mr. Sarabji?
Yes, to some extent, but the whole question is, after all, it's the collegium which has the final word. Government can tell the collegium about its misgivings, about all the information it has about a proposed judge to be elevated. But thereafter, the collegium reiterates, the government is bound. The final government has a voice, not a veto. Let's be very clear about it. And ultimately is the collegium whose decision will prevail and should prevail.
So let me then bring Mr. Thanka back in here again. Mr. Thanka, if that is, and since that is the truth, that once the government sends the nomination back, if the collegium insists that the government has no choice but to accept the nomination of the collegium. Why have a press conference again today? Why did the opposition decide to raise more questions about the Supreme Court and the judiciary if the government actually doesn't have a veto?
No, the opposition has a role to play in a democracy, and that role is also very, very constitutional. And what did the opposition say today in the press conference? That we stand by an independent judiciary. We do not accept the government's stand of blocking names and keeping it blocked for 4 months from January to April. Supreme Court and High Courts are short of judges. Collegium has been given the task to recommend names. Government has a very small role in that process. That is only to see if any particular name any particular nomination would be contrary to security or some such issue which maybe the collegium didn't know. Anything else on merits is the job of the collegium. Why keep names pending? Why block names? Why separate the file? I mean, all this is being done only to humiliate the judiciary, which is not correct. We stand by democracy, we stand by rule of law, and if there is no independent judiciary, there is no democracy in the country. That's the reason the opposition had to meet and say that today.
Well, Mr. Sorabji, I'm going to come back to you with this question because I want you to respond to what Arimasundaram did say. He said that the reasons, and reason number one is that there are more judges, more senior to Justice Joseph, and they should have been front runners and not him. Secondly, that the state of Kerala would be overrepresented in the Supreme Court. Do you see these as valid reasons from the government of India?
Question is, who has to determine the validity of the reasons? Not the government. Government can put forward its point of view, but ultimately it's the collegium which has to decide. Various factors, but ultimately, look, the crux of the matter is, who is the final voice in the appointment of judges, on the elevation of judges? Is the Supreme Court, is the collegium. So therefore, all other factors which may be taken into consideration, but the collegium's voice should prevail and will prevail. And that's how we maintain the independence of the judiciary. That's how we maintain the public's perception of the independence of the judiciary. Now, because the public, there are yes, the judges will dispense justice without fear of favor, and that impression which the public has, the litigating public has, should not be in any manner affected.
Mr. Sundaram, do you want to rebut that?
Sorry? Yes, I agree with Mr. Sorabji that it's the collegium to finally decide. But the point I was making was a bit different. I said there is a very simple way of not acting. First of all, while the collegium has to decide, the collegium gives the names to the government. The government sits on the names for 4 months. Someone in some other shows used a very beautiful word for it. They used the American expression, it's a pocket veto. Government has no power to veto. What they do instead is they sit on it for 4 months so that nothing really happens for 4 months. After which, they send it back. Now, if they sent it back, and they send it back with reasons which are at least reasons for which a government can be concerned, issues of integrity or suspected integrity, issues of security, other reasons, it's all right. But to say that, look, he's not senior enough, or others are more senior, or that there's already one judge from the state of Kerala, surely the collegium, when they recommended his name, knew very well what his seniority was, knew very well that there was a judge from Kerala, knew very well that this very same government, I remember, and Mr. Sorabji will also, I'm sure, vouchsafe, that one of our finest judges, Chief Justice Kapadia, was quite junior in the, and I think the junior most Chief Justice, and quite junior, but yet he was elevated when Mr. Sorabji, I think, was the Attorney General of India. And that's perfectly all right. My point is, first of all, you sit on it for 4 months. What are you doing then? There are vacancies which you're not allowing to be filled up. Why? Because you're not happy with the name there. So you delay it for 4 months. After 4 months, send it back with 2 reasons. which already the collegium is aware of. You haven't given them something new which they don't know about, which they have to think about. That is the purpose of the government sending something back to the collegium. In case you were not aware of something, we are making you aware of this. Now consider that, and you still have the same view. Not telling the collegium what the collegium already knows. That's why I say these are not reasons at all. And it's nothing but a dilatory tactic to see that a person who gave the Uttarakhand judgment against the government is not being elevated. And that is the only purpose as far as I can see. And I am talking from a lawyer's perception. Maybe others will see it differently, but that's the way I see it.
Well, if, given what Mr. Sundaram is saying right now, that's extremely disconcerting. Mr. Sarabji, I want you to respond to this. If judges are going to have to worry about this, if they give a judgment that goes against the current government and it affects their future positions or their future nominations, that is the executive interfering with the judiciary in the worst possible way. This comes in the way of democracy as we know it, Mr. Sarabji. Should we all be concerned?
No, but I don't think our judges are so spineless as to be bothered about this. But in any case, why create a situation whereby they may be embarrassed? All judges are not of the same spine. Some of them may rather try to not displease the executive. So why create such a situation? To my mind, the point is very clear. Collegium considers the government's reservations, information, thereafter reiterate, thereafter it's bound. And if it's not otherwise, have a writ file a writ petition in the Supreme Court and have the government carry out the recommendation of the collegium. Very clear. Don't bring out politics into it. Don't bring political parties into it. The thing is, finally, again I repeat, who has the final word? The collegium.
Mr. Sarabji, I want to bring you in on one more conversation. If we look at, and you spoke with me last week when there was that impeachment motion that was brought forward. If you consider all of the things that have happened since January this year, the press conference of the 4 judges, 3 of those 4 judges writing letters to the Chief Justice, one senior judge again writing another letter to the Chief Justice about the fact that there are vacancies that need to be filled. After that, an impeachment motion, and now this. Our Supreme Court has been shrouded one way or the other with questions for several months. Is this something really that we should continue to brush aside?
What exactly is the question? What do you wanted to answer?
Do you believe us...
I didn't get the gist of the question.
Do you believe our judiciary is in crisis, Mr. Sarabji?
Sorry?
Do you believe...
No. Okay. I don't think so. That's rather too exaggerated view.
Okay.
I don't think it's in crisis, but it is undergoing a phase which it should not. And the thing is, if people concerned, everyone acts in a spirit of cordiality and has the main objective in view all the time, namely independence of the judiciary and the public's confidence in its independence to deliver justice without fear or favor. That's very important, and this should not be affected. Minor skirmishes here and there are different, but this should not be done. And I think press conference, frankly, if you ask me, I didn't quite like that. To give a press conference in public, but that's what's happened. It's over. Let's now rehabilitate the situation to the extent we can.
Right. I'm going to ask Mr. Thankar to respond to that. Press conference is being held by the opposition, Mr. Thankar, and this has been brought up several times that they could have done everything they needed to without holding the press conference. For example, we even had the Vice President comment on the fact that the motion to impeach could have been moved without holding a press conference and reading out all of those charges to the national audience. What was the need to hold the press conference? Hasn't the opposition effectively brought in politics, intimidated the Chief Justice or attempted to intimidate the Chief Justice? And hasn't the opposition used whatever power it has to draw a big question mark on the Supreme Court?
I'll answer this a little later, but you would have to understand the pattern of developments that have taken place in the last few months. I mean, the pattern, Mr. Sorabji is very senior. I would not like to contradict him, but the fact is that there is a crisis in the judiciary. There is a pattern of crisis also. About that pattern of crisis, 4 senior judges who must have felt so disgusted, came out and spoke about it. Then the senior judges are writing letters which now come into public domain. Obviously, this affects the democracy and the equilibrium of our judiciary. Obviously, the opposition is going to speak about it. I mean, there is nothing like you can't speak about judiciary. I mean, judiciary is as much an arm of the constitution as a parliament or the executive. When you see problems in an institution, people are going to speak about it. You can't gag people. You can't stop people from talking. And certainly, I remember in 2009, this is 15 December 2009, when Justice Dinakaran's motion was tabled by the opposition at that time, Mr. Jaitley and Mr. Sitaram Yechuri, minutes after tabling that motion, came out and addressed the press. Now, so to say that why you address the press today and why they did this 6 years back, I mean, I'm not going to answer all that. It's part of the democratic feature. It's part of the democracy that we have. When issues get into public domain, people are allowed to speak, opposition will speak, ruling party will have its rebuttal. All this takes place in a democracy, so we should not feel bad about it. But the more important thing is, today we should all work towards the consolidation of judiciary. And for a consolidation of judiciary, I think the entire court needs to sit and think about what is the way forward. What is the future of this institution? Because we want this institution to be important, to be energetic, to be able to deliver justice, and with trust and dignity which it always deserved.
Doesn't it already have that, Mr. Thankar? Isn't it, as an institution, the Supreme Court, important and energetic and delivering justice and holding the trust of the people? Is there a question there?
How can you be energetic when you don't have judges being appointed? If for 4 months names are withheld, when you have 7 vacancies, I believe 6, 7 judges are retiring this year. You see the vacancies in High Court. I mean, in a number of 1,000 judges, 400 vacancies, and you think that people don't get to have matters decided for 10 years and 15 years. What is this quality of delivery of justice then? I mean, look at the common man, what he feels. And if opposition doesn't speak of these things, who's going to speak? Obviously, we are going to speak because it's the duty of every man to ensure that the institutions work to the best of their ability. And that is what is the intent today. Nobody wants to interfere with the working of judiciary. I mean, judiciary is very important for this country. It's very important for the democracy of this country. But we want judiciary should work unhindered and unhampered by the ruling government.
Right.
Now, today, ruling government has, according to us, has an agenda to weaken judiciary.
But you don't see, Mr. Thankar, you don't see the move to impeach the Chief Justice of India as also an attempt to intimidate by the opposition?
No, I won't call it intimidation. It's a process which is allowed under the Constitution. Whether it is correct or incorrect, it will be judged. It has been judged by the Vice President, against which the MPs are allowed to go to the court. That's another issue, whether how the courts will react to it, how they decide the matter, and what they decide is final also. But to say that there can be no impeachment or nobody should initiate the process, I don't think I agree with that. In the past also, there have been, maybe not against the Chief Justice of India, but for lesser people, lesser judges, yes, smaller, it had been happening. But yes, I personally, I also feel that what has happened today is a very sad state of affairs. We should not have reached this state of affairs, but maybe if we were all vigilant, if the judges as a community was more vigilant, if the government had not been interfering in the working of the judiciary, I'm sure all this would not have happened.
Mr. Sundaram, to respond to this, Mr. Sundaram, the argument that this is allowed in the Constitution will be used by all political parties, including the government of the day, who will say sending back a nomination is allowed in the Constitution. So we're doing it. What's the harm? Now, here's the point. If everybody does this, what will we have left?
In fact, Faye, Mr. Tanka voiced some very nice sentiments, like let the judiciary do its work, let the judiciary function. We all want to consolidate the judiciary. We all want to strengthen the judiciary. It's a pillar of the democracy. He said some very nice words. I only wish the party to which he belongs also reciprocates or has those same feelings. Let's not forget that what the greatest objection about this entire impeachment issue was the complete politicizing of it. It almost became a political byplay, a political prize fight, where the opposition party sought to take on the ruling party, and in the middle, the casualty, the collateral damage became the judiciary. It almost became, at least to the mind's eye of someone who's looking on, who's apolitical like me, it almost became as the opposition is looking for every opportunity to hit at the ruling party, and now they've dragged in this issue. When one looks at the entire way this impeachment was politicized, one started wondering, I mean, where will the politicians stop? To what extent would politicians go in order to attack each other? It is, after all, the important role of each wing, each arm of government, as Mr. Tanka said, to strengthen the other arms of government. One arm of government for its own aggrandizement doesn't weaken another arm. And that's what I'm objecting to even regarding today's issue. Saying what has been happening is there is an attempt to weaken the judiciary, which please do not do. I can only appeal to every politician. I can appeal to the other two arms of government. Please don't do that, because don't forget that a camera which stands on a tripod, you take one of those legs off and that camera is going to fall. So please, for God's sake, don't politicize things to such an extent that you start belittling the judiciary. The common man in India, even today, the one institution he has faith in is the judiciary. You as politicians, please do not try to belittle that. I'm not talking about the ruling party. I'm not talking about the opposition. I'm talking about the general class of politicians. I'm talking about the class which represents the legislature. Now, that class, I feel, is not working hard enough to ensure that the judiciary does live up to its role. And let's not forget one thing, Faye. I've always believed that the biggest problem which has come up now is the executive appears to see the judiciary as an adversary. The role, instead of being complementary, the role, instead of being two people tugging in the same direction, has become almost adversarial in nature. And this adversarial role ends up in one destroying the other, or attempting to destroy the other, or weaken the other, which is a complete anathema to democracy. Democracy itself, being the very foundation of our Constitution, is an anathema to our Constitution.
Right. Siddharth Luthra joins us as well. Mr. Siddharth Luthra is a senior advocate with the Supreme Court. A brilliant mind. I'm very glad to have him on the show. Mr. Luthra, thank you for joining us. We also have Mr. Sundaram, Mr. Sarabji and Mr. Tanka already on the show. Mr. Luthra, to bring you up to speed with what was said so far, Mr. Sundaram believes that the members of our political class are interfering or attempting to interfere, attempting to intimidate members of the judiciary with what has happened today, the withholding of the nomination of one judge, with what happened last week with an impeachment motion from the opposition. Do you believe that this is what's happening? Politics is coming in and attempting to intimidate the judiciary.
I think there is, of course, a political ideology and angle to it, and that political ideology is played out, and I agree entirely with Mr. Tanka. Our political class now has to realize they have to be a little more sensitive to allow this institution to coexist, allow the institution of judiciary to survive. I would like to remind you of a beautiful sentence which was argued in para 102 of the 1991 subcommittee judgment, where it said that a motion to remove a judge must not be politically motivated. Otherwise, you'll be impacting not just the functioning of the judge, but the judiciary entirely. Having said that, the refusal or the return back of the name of Justice Joseph, a very fine, a very brilliant judge, very judicious, is also very unfortunate, because there is, according to me, the two reasons that were given as are made out in the public domain. One, that there are many people from his state, which according to me is no reason. Secondly, that he's amongst the junior most of the Chief Justices. That again is no reason. We have enough precedent in the past that people have been appointed to the highest court even though they were not a Chief Justice. So we have to now see the merit of people, and if the collegium feels that there is merit in a person, unless there is some exceptionally great reason, I don't think it was appropriate to return it. It is time for people of all political hues and colors to have some serious introspection. This whole debate, whether in relation to the impeachment process or in relation to Justice Joseph's appointment, and I'm told there was a petition even filed today to try and stop the oath of Ms. Indu Malhotra, who will be a judge of the Supreme Court tomorrow, is deplorable. This is not how our system should be allowed to function, or our system should function. It's a very sad state of affairs, and it's time for all of them to get their heads together. I hope they can. I hope that's the level of statesmanship we expect from our political class. And if they don't have it, it's time for them to seriously think about it and move on. Otherwise, they must also remember that when they are in times of trouble, this is the institution that protects them, that saves them. And that is the reason you'll find that there are people within the political class who have stayed out of the various controversies and have expressed their confidence in the system, in the judiciary, and hope for a better day.
Mr. Luthra, if you believe that the two reasons that the government of India have given out for reasons of rejecting or sending back that appointment today are not good enough, then is it fair to conclude that the striking down of President's rule in Uttarakhand, which was seen as a blow to the BJP, is the only other reason that's possible for this move, which means that the government is actually, in this case, bringing in vendetta into the appointment of a judge, something we simply cannot have?
Faye, that's an inference you choose to draw. We would have to go by the reasons declared in the file, and it is up to the collegium to say, we don't agree, we reiterate our submissions. In fact, there's a serious concern, and the concern is both names have been kept lingering. They've just lingered for months on end, and that's a very unfortunate state of affairs. And that is the area which requires introspection. The Department of Justice has always had a role in the appointment of judges. It used to be a lot greater before the collegium system, and now it is relatively diminished. There is a desire or an apparent attempt on the part of governments over the last few years to assert themselves through the Department of Justice, and we are seeing an aspect of that today. But having said that, the question is, how far should the collegium allow this to go on? The collegium should examine the reasons as recorded in the file, and I'm finding it very painful that, yesterday also I found that the files relating to Justice Deepak Mishra's appointments in various stages were being bandied about in the public domain. These are secret, confidential matters, and these are matters where the process is such because the person who gets appointed, if appointed despite the objections, must be left to allow to do their work independently. Otherwise, you're impacting the person's decision-making capability, as also impacting the institution. So I would believe, and I'm hopeful, that what has happened, but the collegium will take a view, and I'm hopeful that we'll soon see Justice Joseph within the Supreme Court, a fine judge, a judicious mind, and I would say one of our better Chief Justices, and we've seen him as a High Court judge also. We're very hopeful that that will happen. This aberration too shall pass.
Well, I'm going to put another question. I have two more questions. I'm going to put another question before my entire panel, and that's this question. Is there an attempt to affect the independence of the judiciary? Because one of the arguments that came forth on the impeachment motion was that because members of the opposition saw received what they saw as judgments that were not favorable, they moved to impeach. And in this case, because the government received a judgment in Uttarakhand that it saw as not favorable, it has decided to hold back the appointment of a judge. This is an attempt then to interfere with the independence of our judiciary. Mr. Sarabji, do you see this as an attempt to interfere with the independence?
Yeah, attempt, but a futile attempt. Because I'm sure our judges have sufficient guts, sufficient spine, not to be in any way embarrassed, but to discharge their duties without fear or favor and restore the confidence of the litigating public in the institution of the judiciary, which to my mind is most important. I think it's very simple. Collegium may say we consider the reasons, the information given of the government, but we don't agree. Reiterate the recommendation, and that should be the end of the matter. And I hope government also doesn't take it to a length where it is being dragged into court and amendments will have to be issued against them for the elevation of Justice Joseph.
But Mr. Sarabji, even if there is an attempt, and one hopes that our judges didn't have to function under this constant shadow of the executive attempting to worry them or intimidate them, but shouldn't we expect more from our members of parliament than to put this sort of pressure on our judiciary and our judges?
My dear members of parliament are more concerned with the particular parties and their agenda. If members of parliament did this, then this problem wouldn't arise. The whole question is because of partisan motives, considerations come into play that this situation arises. I think, really speaking, if you ask me, the ball is the court of the Chief Justice, the collegium must assert itself, and the government should gracefully accept the decision. End.
Well, that may be fair, Mr. Sarabji. What stops then the politicians from raking up a new issue come Monday? And I want to take this question to Mr. Thankar. Mr. Thankar, respond to what Mr. Sarabji said, that members of parliament are only concerned about their own politics. But is it fair really to drag our judiciary into it? Are we making the Chief Justice of India and our Supreme Court collateral damage in what has turned out to be a really ugly fight between two political parties?
As I said in my last interjection, that personally I'm very sorry about what I see in Supreme Court. This is not the court of my dreams. I mean, I never thought that I would be practicing in a court which would see so much of crisis or whatever you may call it. But it is also time for the court as a body to introspect that what is the issue which is making us so vulnerable to public. Ultimately, unless and until you are weak or you have a problem, others will not be able to step in. Somewhere we have permitted others to step in and speak on our issues, which should not have happened. So, in my opinion, and that's I think a sensible view also, that there is need for deep introspection within the court amongst all the judges to see how we can now limit the damage or eliminate the damage and take things forward.
But Mr. Thankar,
at the same time,
forgive me for interrupting you.
The ruling party has a huge role to play.
Forgive me for interrupting you. Even the letters that were written between the brother judges were not marked to either BJP or Congress. So what place does the opposition have to bring them up in a press conference in front of the whole country, make them public in that manner, and then create doubts in the minds of citizens about the Supreme Court?
I'm sorry, opposition didn't bring the letters in the public domain. It's the press and the media. We learnt about it only from the press and media. So don't keep blaming the opposition. Frankly speaking, it's the courts which need to introspect, which need to think about their own future, which is the future of the country, in fact. Also, it is very important for the government also to rethink about its strategy in dealing with judiciary. The government must realize that today they are in government, but tomorrow somebody else can be in government. And day after tomorrow there can be another government. So nobody is permanent in this system. Democracy is one of the good parts of democracy. So each one of us should learn to respect talent which the collegium selects. Each one of us should remember that it's the duty of the government to ensure that the judiciary feels comfortable working in this environment. My problem today is that there is a pattern which has been unleashed against the judiciary and the judges, where they get a feeling that nobody knows who will become a Chief Justice. I mean, today Calcutta High Court is closed for last 2 months because you are not appointing judges there. There are any number of courts which are protesting for non-appointment of judges, and the names that are sent very often are not accepted by the government for reasons which are not very good reasons. So the government must also rethink on this whole issue, that trust your judiciary, trust your collegium, and the collegium and the judges as a whole must also introspect that there is a problem which has affected them. They should again rethink on these issues and come back with solutions so that the trust of the people is regained once again.
Well, Mr. Sundaram, is the threat to the judiciary caused by a rift from within, or is it caused from external forces? Let's consider the fact that 4 judges had that press conference in January, and when it happened, we all got together on this very show and talked about how it's unprecedented. And you yourself said we should leave it to the judiciary to handle it internally. We should not have this conversation. But as recently as yesterday, there was another letter written by a senior judge to the Chief Justice asking for a meeting. So is it fair to accept that those differences have not been settled internally and we're still having a problem?
Hey, the judiciary plays a pivotal role in a democracy. The judges of the court who comprise the judiciary are also well aware of the pivotal role that they play. When some judges express displeasure or unhappiness over certain aspects of administration, it is but natural. I think it is much more positive that when some judges feel something is wrong to come out and talk about it, rather than brush it under the carpet. That itself shows that judges are aware of the pivotal role that the judiciary plays and want to ensure that it continues playing that pivotal role. Now that is why I'm saying it's a matter for the judiciary to itself resolve, and the judiciary will resolve it. It's a strong judiciary, it will resolve it. And I think that is where the problem seems to be coming up, is because it's a strong judiciary, there is much politicizing by the political parties which try to make various holes in this judiciary, so that they try to make people feel, oh, this judiciary is not as great as you should think it is, because this is the judiciary which is keeping the politician, the executive in check. And I believe that that is why the independence of the judiciary is vital, is absolutely vital. And any attempts to interfere with such independence of the judiciary is actually suicidal to democracy itself. I think every politician, the executive, should be mature enough to know, if they ever can be, to know that their role is vital to preserve a democracy, and that if they in any way act against it, they're only hurting the very democracy which is India.
Well, Mr. Luthra, do you believe that in some way there has been a stain now on the Supreme Court, that the majesty of the Supreme Court has, in the minds of ordinary citizens, been brought into question?
There are stages of evolution in the life of each institution. We've seen those phases in the Supreme Court in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, and now this is another stage when we're seeing an evolution in this court, and there will be evolution. In any room, if you put 25, 20 odd people, you'll lock them in a room, keep them in one building, and you'll find they'll all have different viewpoints, and those different viewpoints need to be aired within that system, and also at some stages they are going to get aired publicly, because after all, the people who sit there are human beings. They're just like you and me. It's just that they have to meet a higher standard. My belief and my hope is that this too shall pass. We will emerge from this with a stronger system, with a more vibrant system. The only concern is that we must move on from this, and the court must move on from this, as also the political class, to realize that this kind of squabbling, and especially in the public sphere, especially with the kind of frivolous allegations which are being made on the drop of a hat for every issue, where everybody is looked at with suspicion, this is detrimental to the cause of democracy. Each limb of democracy coexists. The reason that we have a very, very stringent process for impeachment is only because it was believed, and way back, this is 200 years ago, even in the US federal papers, where they said that judiciary is the limb of government which has a very high standard to bear and yet is the weakest because it has to use the government of the day to enforce its orders. Today we're in a situation where the government of the day, and it's not just today, it's going on for the last many years, where governments find that it's the judges who keep rapping them on the knuckles, where the political class finds, and phrases have been used, the tyranny of the unelected. Well, I would not call it tyranny. I believe it's the check of those who are appointed to a high constitutional office. And it is important today that we should treat and respect that as a high constitutional office. The manner in which a lot of us have tried to besmirch that high constitutional office is deplorable, and that's something which needs to be checked at the earliest. And unfortunately, I find that that is going on unabated. Having said that, the collegium's views have to be respected. The collegium's decisions have to be acknowledged. There may be exceptional cases where there is, for good recorded reasons, the government may have a serious objection, but barring those rare exceptions, a person who's come in through the ranks through 15, 20 years of judging, you've seen that person's credibility and conduct. And therefore, I really don't see the reason why they should be delayed. Today, you must remember the biggest crisis in the court. We have about 25 to 26 judges. By the end of the year, 7 more will retire. By the time we'll have 18 judges at the end of the year, if there are no appointments, well, there's going to be one tomorrow. But that's the crisis we are facing, and a court which is at 2/3 or less than 2/3 its strength is not a court which is able to do work to its optimum, and that's the concern. All of them have to get their heads together, and we have to move on.
Well, Mr. Luthra, do you believe that the slow appointment of judges, or the lack of judges that we're facing right now, is a deliberate attempt in some way to slow down the judiciary or to hurt it?
The names have to come from the collegiums. And if the collegiums are taking time in determining the names, it's going to take a long time. These 6 or 7 appointments have been waiting. It's for the judges in the high courts and the Supreme Courts to put their head together. And I'll give you a classic example. Last year, Allahabad High Court appointed 19 judges. This year, 19 are retiring. Why is it that the High Court could not consider that they have to reach a peak of 160? Now that's the difficulty. So it's a combination of factors. You can't just blame one limb of the government, but they all have to work together. And we should, if we have 160 judges in Allahabad or 31 judges in Supreme Court, why are we not starting the appointment process before we have a retirement? And why do we wait for somebody to retire and then appoint them? Why should there be vacancies at all?
But Mr. Sundaram disagrees with you. Mr. Sundaram, do you see this as a deliberate attempt to weaken the judiciary by not appointing judges on time?
I would never have thought that I'd hear myself saying this, Faye. Like I said, when the NJSC judgment came out, I was not in favor. I felt the executive should have a role in the appointment of the judiciary. I did not agree with some parts of the act, but otherwise I felt as a concept it was right. But I'm afraid that my views have changed over the last few months. For example, and I'll tell you the reasons why. First of all, it started with the delay of the government dragging its feet over the MOP. The MOP not being finalized, and the MOP being brought in was something which was brought in the NJSC judgment, saying that, all right, if the executive needs a role, let's bring in a role, let's have an MOP, let's see how this can work. Having done that, first we saw the government dragging its feet on the MOP. The next we saw were recommendations which did go, sitting on those recommendations for a period of time. The third stage we saw is 4 months ago, recommendation has gone for 2 judges of the Supreme Court. We have 1/3 of a year has gone by. There are 7 vacancies in the Supreme Court, 2 names have gone, they've been sat on for 1/3 of a year. Again you sit on it, then this sending it back on this ground, which according to me is not ground enough. But then I'm asking myself, if it's sent again the government sits on it, yes, as Mr. Sorabji said, then the appointment has to take place. But when? Is there a period of time? Is it in 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks? Well, if they're going to sit on it, again. Now, when I see this whole thing in perspective, when I see the whole thing, I start wondering, is this government keen that there should not really be a strong judiciary? Is this government keen that its action should not really be looked at that way? And I'm a person who never thought so a few months ago. But the way things are transpiring from the series of events I've been pointing out, I'm starting to get worried. I'm starting to get worried whether there is really going to be an attempt, and I say an attempt because I have too much faith in the judiciary, an attempt at the erosion of the independence of the judiciary. Because I, as a true Democrat, do believe that you have to have independence of the judiciary, you have to have separation of powers, you have to have each limb of the government respecting the other, not fighting to belittle the other. And when I see more and more politicization, including with that impeachment motion, now with whatever's going on, I find more and more politicizing all these actions dragging in the judiciary. I'm forced to feel that maybe the executive feels it suits its purposes not to have a strong judiciary. And that's a very worrying factor. It takes me back 40 years, a period no one who really wants to go back to.
Mr. Sarabji, is the government attempting to weaken the judiciary?
No, I don't think so, Faye. I don't think it's attempting to weaken the judiciary deliberately, but that may be the effect of some of its actions. That itself is bad enough. But frankly, I'm optimistic the matter will be resolved. As I said, in one sense, the ball is the court of the Chief Justice. And I'm sure the government, which has people like Arun Jaitley, Ravi Shankar Prasad, others who fought for the independence of the judiciary, will also not embark on a collision course and will gracefully accept the decision of the collegium given after considering the government's point of view. But I'm hopeful, I'm confident, optimistic, and I hope I'm not over-optimistic. And I do share Sundaram's misgivings, but I think, after all, one thing is necessary. There may be differences in the collegium, but they must speak with one clear voice. And people must know what that voice is, must be clear, unequivocal. No impression of a collegium being divided should be given. That would be terrible.
But Mr. Sarabji,
I'm sure it will not happen.
Forgive me, but you said, of course, the government already has legal minds who are officers of the court who now hold ministerial positions. So surely you must know that they can't be naive enough to have created a situation where their actions may be causing a weakness that they're unaware of. So if there are positions being held back, they must know what sort of impact that will have on a court and a system that's already struggling with the fact that there are vacancies in the system.
Yes, I agree with you. But as I said, I'm guarded optimism I have that the government will not, in any case, embark on a course of action which will really affect the independence of the judiciary and, more important, the public perception of the independence of judiciary.
Right, gentlemen, I have to wrap up this discussion, but I can't thank you enough for the time you have given us this evening, helping us understand what is going on with our judiciary. It's an unusual situation for us on the channel when all panelists agree with each other, and the point, I think, of agreement was that the two reasons given to us by the government of India for the rejection of or the holding back of the nomination of Justice Joseph are not valid. The reason number one was that he's not senior enough. None of the members on our panel agreed that that was a valid reason. The second one, that the state of Kerala would be overrepresented, is not a valid reason either, according to all four legal minds who spoke to us. Remember, this judge was responsible for setting aside President's rule in the state of Uttarakhand and bringing back that Congress government. It was seen as a massive blow to the BJP. Is it political vendetta or not? That's something we will have to see. But for now, the move that the government has taken today is not valid. And it does seem like everybody agrees that various forms and arms of political society have taken turns to swing at our judiciary. Remember, as citizens of India, our judiciary is our final hope for justice, for rights, and for protection. It is in our interest that our judiciary be protected, be safe, and continue to be majestic. One hopes that the political class will learn to stop seeing the judiciary as an adversary, because it is simply doing its job by keeping various governments in check. As citizens, we continue to look to our judiciary for justice and for protection of our rights. Thanks for watching.